The truth about narcissistic relationships is that they leave people asking questions long after the relationship has officially ended. One of the most common questions that lingers in the quiet hours is this: does the narcissist ever feel ashamed of how they treated me? It is an entirely understandable question to ask because when you have invested your heart, your trust, and your emotional energy into someone who repeatedly dismissed your feelings, manipulated your reality, or made you doubt your own worth, you naturally want to believe that one day they will realize the damage they caused. But truly understanding narcissistic behavior requires separating hope from reality. Shame, guilt, regret, and genuine accountability are not the same thing at all. And confusing these distinct emotions can keep you emotionally attached to someone who is fundamentally incapable of giving you the closure you deserve. The purpose of our discussion today is not to help you understand the narcissist so you can somehow fix them. It is to help you understand them so you can finally free yourself. Education is one of the greatest forms of emotional protection available to you. The more clearly you understand what is happening beneath the surface, the less likely you are to personalize their behavior or blame yourself for the pain they caused. One of the biggest misconceptions about narcissism is that narcissists never experience shame whatsoever. The reality is actually much more complex than that. At the core of many narcissistic personalities lies an overwhelming hidden fear of being exposed as inadequate, flawed, or unworthy. Emotionally healthy people can acknowledge their imperfections without feeling completely destroyed by them. They understand that making a mistake does not define their entire identity or worth as a human being. A narcissist, however, often experiences flaws and mistakes very differently. To them, admitting they hurt someone may feel like admitting they are fundamentally defective. Because that emotional experience is so deeply threatening to them, they develop powerful psychological defenses to avoid facing it altogether. Instead of simply saying that they made a mistake, they convince themselves that someone else caused the problem in the first place. Instead of feeling vulnerable, they become defensive. Instead of accepting responsibility, they rewrite history. This is precisely why people who have been in relationships with narcissists often feel so confused. They expect the exact same emotional process they would experience if they had hurt someone, but narcissistic defenses interrupt that process long before genuine accountability can ever occur. When shame begins to surface within them, it rarely looks like sadness or sincere remorse. Instead, it often disguises itself as anger, criticism, blame, or an intense need for control. This is one of the most important concepts to understand because many survivors mistakenly take these reactions for signs of confidence or complete indifference. In reality, these behaviors function as a form of emotional armor. Imagine looking into a mirror that reflects every hurtful thing you have ever done. A healthy person may feel uncomfortable looking at that reflection, but they can eventually accept it and grow from the experience. A narcissist often cannot tolerate looking at that reflection at all. Rather than changing themselves, they attempt to break the mirror. They criticize the people who challenge them, attack those who hold them accountable, spread damaging rumors, or portray themselves as the innocent victim of the situation. These behaviors are certainly not signs of emotional strength. They are clear signs of emotional avoidance. The louder they blame others, the harder they may be working to silence the shame they simply cannot bear to face. Understanding this does not excuse their behavior, but it certainly helps explain why meaningful change is so rare with these individuals. Many people spend years waiting in hope that the narcissist will finally apologize, admit the truth, or acknowledge the deep pain they caused. While genuine apologies are entirely possible in healthy relationships, they are far less common when narcissistic patterns are deeply established. Feeling ashamed is never the same thing as taking responsibility. A person may privately experience discomfort, embarrassment, or even regret, while still flatly refusing to admit they were wrong. Why does this happen? Because acknowledging the truth threatens the carefully constructed image they have spent years protecting at all costs. Instead of apologizing, they may minimize your pain, justify their actions, or insist that you misunderstood everything from the start. They may even turn the tables and accuse you of being the abusive one in the dynamic. This can leave survivors questioning their own memories and wondering whether they imagined the abuse entirely. This is precisely why education is so powerful for your recovery. Once you recognize these patterns for what they are, you stop expecting accountability from someone whose emotional survival depends entirely on avoiding it. You no longer waste years waiting for words that may never come. One of the most surprising realities of this journey is that your own healing can actually become one of the strongest reminders of their hidden shame. When you stop chasing them, stop defending yourself, stop arguing, and begin rebuilding your confidence, you quietly remove the role they always expected you to play. Narcissistic relationships often rely heavily on emotional dependence. They expect you to keep seeking their approval, explaining yourself endlessly, or hoping they will eventually become the person you always believed they could be. But when you begin living peacefully without them, something profound changes. Your growth becomes undeniable evidence that their control is no longer working. You become a living reminder that their version of the story was never the whole truth. This does not mean they will suddenly admit everything they did to you. In many cases, they may become even more dismissive, more critical, or even attempt to re-enter your life through hoovering tactics. These reactions are not necessarily proof of love or genuine remorse on their part. More often, they simply reflect their deep discomfort with losing the influence they once held over you. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that your healing must never depend on another person's self-awareness. Waiting for a narcissist to admit they hurt you places your entire emotional future in the hands of someone who has repeatedly demonstrated an absolute inability to provide emotional safety. That is an incredibly painful position to remain in, but it is also one that you have the absolute power to leave behind. Your value has never depended on their apology. Your truth has never depended on their agreement. Your recovery has never required their permission to begin. The strongest form of closure is not hearing them finally say that they were wrong. The strongest form of closure is reaching a point where those words are simply no longer necessary for your peace of mind. That is true emotional freedom. That is the moment you reclaim your identity, and that is the exact moment the relationship truly loses its power over you for good. When you invest your energy in understanding yourself instead of spending it trying to understand why they refuse to change, you begin creating a life defined not by the pain they caused, but by the strength, wisdom, and resilience you discovered while overcoming it. That is a victory that no narcissist can ever take away from you. Have you ever found yourself lying awake at night wondering if the person who hurt you ever thinks about what they did? Maybe you replay conversations over and over in your mind, searching for the exact moment everything changed. Maybe you ask yourself whether they ever experienced guilt, regret, or shame for the way they manipulated you, dismissed your feelings, or made you question your own reality. These questions are incredibly common among people who have experienced narcissistic relationships because emotional abuse rarely ends with clear, satisfying answers. Instead, it leaves behind a heavy fog of confusion, lingering self-doubt, and an overwhelming desire to understand what actually happened. But before we can properly answer whether a narcissist feels shame, we first have to understand what shame actually is and how it fundamentally differs from guilt and accountability. These words are often thrown around interchangeably in everyday conversation, but psychologically, they describe very different internal experiences. Healthy shame is an uncomfortable emotional signal that tells us we have acted in a way that conflicts with our core values. It encourages reflection, empathy, and personal growth. Guilt says that I did something wrong. Healthy accountability says that I recognize the harm I caused, I take full responsibility, and I want to make things right. These emotional processes help people repair relationships and become much better versions of themselves over time. They require true humility, honesty, and the willingness to tolerate deeply uncomfortable emotions without running away from them. Most emotionally healthy people are quite capable of this, even though the process is never easy. Narcissistic personalities often struggle immensely with this process because their entire emotional world is built around protecting a fragile sense of self. While they may appear intensely confident, superior, or even invincible on the outside, many psychologists explain that this outward image functions primarily as a defense mechanism against deep feelings of inadequacy and vulnerability. To someone with strong narcissistic traits, admitting fault can feel less like simply acknowledging a mistake and more like admitting they are fundamentally worthless. That emotional experience becomes so threatening that the mind automatically creates heavy defenses to push shame away before it can ever be consciously processed. This is precisely why people are often left deeply confused after confronting a narcissist about their hurtful behavior. Instead of hearing that they are right and receiving a sincere apology, they hear endless excuses, blame, denial, or counterattacks. The conversation suddenly becomes entirely about your flaws instead of their harmful actions. They may insist that you completely misunderstood them, accuse you of being far too sensitive, or claim that everything was actually your fault from the very beginning. These reactions are never signs of emotional maturity. They are protective strategies designed to keep painful self-reflection safely at a distance. Understanding this distinction is incredibly important for your peace of mind, because many survivors mistakenly believe that if they could simply explain themselves better, provide more evidence, or remain patient long enough, the narcissist would eventually understand the pain they caused. Unfortunately, true emotional insight cannot be forced onto someone whose defenses are built entirely around avoiding it. The more directly their behavior threatens their carefully constructed self-image, the more likely they are to become defensive rather than reflective. This realization can feel disappointing and heavy at first, but it is also deeply liberating once it truly settles in. It means their refusal to acknowledge your pain is not proof that your experience wasn't real. It is not evidence that you deserved the mistreatment or that you failed to communicate effectively with them. Most of the time, it simply reflects their profound inability to tolerate the emotional discomfort that genuine accountability requires. Once you understand that vital difference, you stop measuring your self-worth by their willingness to admit the truth. Instead of that, you begin trusting your own lived experiences, honoring your own personal healing, and recognizing that real closure does not always come from another person offering an apology. Sometimes, closure simply comes from understanding why that apology may never arrive and choosing to move forward with your life anyway. That subtle yet powerful shift in perspective is precisely where true emotional freedom begins for you. One of the most confusing experiences for anyone recovering from narcissistic abuse is witnessing the dramatic, unpredictable reactions that follow even the smallest amount of accountability. You may calmly point out a hurtful comment they made, remind them of a promise they broke, or explain how their actions affected your well-being, fully expecting a mature and thoughtful conversation. Instead, they suddenly become angry, defensive, dismissive, or even downright cruel. In some cases, they will raise their voice, accuse you of attacking them unfairly, bring up past mistakes you made years ago, or completely change the subject to throw you off balance. To someone who has never encountered these toxic patterns before, these reactions can seem completely irrational and baffling. But when viewed through the clear lens of narcissistic defense mechanisms, they begin to make a lot more sense. What often appears to be unshakable confidence or emotional strength on the surface is actually a desperate, frantic attempt to escape feelings they cannot comfortably face. One of those deeply buried feelings is shame. Shame is universally one of the most painful emotions a human being can experience because it does not simply tell us that we made a simple mistake. It whispers deep inside that there is something fundamentally wrong with our core character. Emotionally healthy people can usually separate their specific actions from their overall identity without falling apart. They understand that making poor decisions does not automatically make them permanently bad or unworthy human beings. This healthy mindset allows them to apologize sincerely, learn valuable lessons, and grow as individuals without feeling emotionally destroyed in the process. A narcissistic person, however, struggles immensely to make this vital distinction in their mind. Their fragile self-image depends heavily on appearing successful, superior, highly intelligent, deeply admired, or morally right at all times. Anything that threatens this carefully protected image can feel completely unbearable to them. Rather than sitting quietly with those uncomfortable feelings of imperfection, many narcissists instinctively put up heavy walls to defend themselves. Unfortunately, these protective defenses rarely look like true vulnerability. Instead, they often manifest as sudden anger, harsh criticism, unfair blame, a desire for control, or abrupt emotional withdrawal. For example, if you gently confront them about lying to you, they may instantly accuse you of being paranoid and untrustworthy. If you express genuine sadness over how poorly they treated you, they may call you overly emotional or dramatic. If you establish a healthy personal boundary, they may suddenly paint you out to be selfish or entirely uncaring. These reactive shifts successfully move the attention away from their bad behavior and place the emotional burden squarely back onto your shoulders. This toxic pattern is widely known as psychological projection. Instead of recognizing undesirable qualities that they simply cannot accept within themselves, they unconsciously assign those exact traits to someone else. They may call you manipulative right while they are actively manipulating you. They may accuse you of being controlling while attempting to dominate every single decision you make. They may insist that you are dishonest while hiding the truth from you themselves. For survivors, this creates enormous mental confusion because it causes them to question their very perception of reality. Over time, this creeping self-doubt becomes one of the most damaging and lingering consequences of emotional abuse. Another common defense mechanism is the desperate need to maintain absolute control over the dynamic. If acknowledging your pain would require them to admit they behaved unfairly, they may choose instead to intensify their controlling behaviors to regain the upper hand. This might involve giving you the silent treatment, criticizing your personal achievements, spreading false stories about you to others, or trying to reel your attention back in after long periods of silence. These actions are never evidence that they have finally developed true empathy for you. More often, they are calculated attempts to restore the familiar emotional balance that protects them from confronting uncomfortable inner truths. Understanding these reactions is incredibly empowering because it completely changes the nature of the questions you ask yourself. Instead of sitting around wondering why they are acting this way towards you, you begin asking what it is that they are so desperately trying to avoid. That mental shift allows you to stop personalizing every insult, every unfair accusation, and every calculated attempt to undermine your self-confidence. Their frantic reactions become mere information rather than accurate definitions of your true worth as a person. Most importantly, recognizing these recurring patterns gently reminds you that another person's inability to face their own hidden shame should never become your responsibility to fix or carry. You cannot heal someone else by absorbing their toxic blame, accepting their projections, or sacrificing your own emotional well-being to keep the peace. Real, lasting healing finally begins when you stop chasing understanding from the exact person who created the confusion in the first place and instead start trusting the clear vision that comes from educating yourself. The more deeply you understand these complex emotional defenses, the less power they will hold over your thoughts, your confidence, and your future happiness. One of the hardest truths to accept after leaving a narcissistic relationship is the reality that someone can secretly experience fleeting moments of shame without ever becoming accountable for the actual harm they caused. Many hopeful survivors hold on tight because they genuinely believe that if the narcissist just feels bad enough about things, a sincere apology will eventually arrive out of nowhere. They imagine a future day when the narcissist will call them up, admit everything they did wrong, acknowledge the deep pain they caused, and finally provide the validation they have been longing for all this time. This hope is entirely understandable because healthy relationships teach us over and over that genuine remorse naturally leads to repair. When emotionally healthy people realize they have hurt someone they truly care about, they usually feel authentic empathy, accept full responsibility, and make a sincere effort to change their hurtful behavior moving forward. They understand deep down that love inherently includes accountability. Unfortunately, narcissistic behavior almost always follows a very different and disappointing path. A narcissist may indeed experience moments of discomfort when they lose a relationship, damage their public reputation, or realize they no longer hold power over someone they once controlled. However, that temporary discomfort does not automatically transform into genuine, mature responsibility. Instead of asking themselves how their bad behavior hurt this other person, they are far more likely to ask how this situation has negatively affected them personally. This crucial difference reveals precisely where their emotional attention is permanently focused. Their primary concern is almost always centered squarely on the negative consequences they are experiencing, rather than the deep pain someone else had to endure because of them. They may deeply miss the endless admiration, the constant attention, the daily convenience, or the control that the relationship provided them. But that does not necessarily mean they have developed any real empathy for the person they mistreated along the way. This exact reason is why many survivors become so deeply confused when a narcissist suddenly reaches out of the blue after months or even years of total silence. The message might sound warm, nostalgic, or even somewhat apologetic on the surface. They might say they have been thinking about you a lot, that they genuinely miss you, or that they simply wish things had turned out differently between you two. While these sweet-sounding words can feel deeply meaningful in the moment, it is critically important to look far beyond the language they use and observe the underlying pattern of behavior. Does the conversation include specific accountability for past wrongs? Or is it filled with vague, empty statements? Do they acknowledge your pain clearly without making excuses? Or do they quickly shift the focus back onto their own feelings and problems? Genuine accountability is always detailed, consistent over time, and accompanied by visibly changed behavior. Empty remorse, on the other hand, is often overly emotional in the immediate moment, but completely disappears as soon as they regain a familiar sense of control over you. Another major reason why accountability is so deeply difficult for narcissistic personalities is that admitting wrongdoing directly threatens the grand identity they have carefully built up over many years. They often see themselves primarily as the innocent victim, the heroic figure, the endlessly misunderstood person, or the one who is always treated unfairly by others. Accepting real responsibility would require them to completely dismantle that comforting story and face deeply uncomfortable truths about their own character. For someone whose core self-worth depends entirely on maintaining a flawless image, this can feel emotionally overwhelming and catastrophic. As a result, they choose to rewrite history instead of facing reality. They may claim that you grossly exaggerated what actually happened, insist that you somehow forced them to behave that way through your own actions, or constantly remind you of your own past mistakes just to avoid discussing theirs. These defensive strategies successfully protect their fragile self-image, but they completely prevent any genuine personal growth. For survivors, this harsh reality can be heartbreaking because it means the exact closure they seek may never arrive in the form they originally imagined. Yet, there is also an incredible sense of freedom found in truly understanding this dynamic. The complete absence of accountability from them is never evidence that your pain was insignificant or meaningless. It is not proof that your memories are inaccurate or that your emotional feelings are invalid in any way. It is simply a clear reflection of another person's deep emotional limitations and psychological blocks. Once you fully recognize this truth, you stop waiting around for someone else to confirm what you already know deep down to be true. You begin trusting your own lived experience instead. Your ongoing healing no longer depends on hearing the words that you were wrong from their mouth. It depends on believing in yourself, honoring your unique journey, and recognizing that your inner peace is far too valuable to leave resting in the hands of someone who is completely unwilling to take responsibility for their own actions. That powerful realization marks the true beginning of your emotional independence. One of the most inspiring and powerful moments in your entire healing journey is when you finally begin to change, not for the narcissist, not to prove a point to anyone, and not to win them back into your life, but purely for yourself. At first, this inner transformation is often quiet and understated. You simply stop responding to every provocative message they send your way. You stop wasting energy defending yourself against their false, fabricated accusations. You stop explaining your personal boundaries over and over again to someone who refuses to respect them. You begin investing your precious energy into your own well-being instead of constantly trying to manage someone else's chaotic emotions for them. While these personal changes may seem small on the outside, they represent a profound seismic shift in the underlying emotional dynamic. The person who once completely depended on your reactions, your constant attention, and your emotional availability suddenly finds that their old manipulation strategies simply do not work anymore. For someone carrying strong narcissistic traits, this realization can be deeply unsettling because your ongoing healing becomes a clear mirror reflecting something they have spent years running away from. One of the defining characteristics of toxic narcissistic relationships is a severe chronic imbalance of power. The narcissist almost always expects to comfortably occupy the position of absolute authority, while the other person remains constantly focused on earning approval, preventing conflict, or restoring harmony at all costs. Over time, this creates an unhealthy, draining cycle in which one person's emotional needs dominate the entire relationship, while the other person's needs are consistently ignored and dismissed. When you finally begin your true healing journey, that exhausting cycle starts to break apart. You no longer seek constant reassurance or validation from them. You stop measuring your self-worth by their fleeting opinions and judgments. You finally recognize that your inner peace is infinitely more valuable than winning another exhausting argument with someone who refuses to see reason. This newfound emotional independence changes the relationship dynamic in ways they may never have anticipated or prepared for. Your visible growth can trigger intense feelings of discomfort within them because it directly challenges the cozy story the narcissist has been telling themselves all along. If they have successfully convinced themselves that you were weak, incapable, or permanently dependent on them for survival, your active recovery completely contradicts that false belief.